Good morning. How we doing? We're glad that you are here with us this morning, ready to jump back into the book of 1 John, continue our series, The Architecture of Change. Thank you for being here in person or joining us online, and we're just blown away by what God's doing in our church, and so excited that we get to continue to gather together. How many of you are dog lovers? Raise your hand. Any dog lovers in the room? So many in the room are dog lovers. Last Saturday, we got a 8-week-old puppy, and his name is Remington. We call him Remy. He is an 8-week-old golden, our English cream golden retriever. And I don't know if you know this, but dogs are lots of work. Puppies are lots of work, and none of my friends here told me that. And so I just want to thank you for that. And also I would say, my wife has very much a puppy voice when she talks to our dog Remy. And when I come home, I don't get the same voice. So I just want to highlight that as well. The dog is treated very different than how I am treated. And so when I walk in, it's like, hey, how are you? She's like, hey. When it's Remy, it's like, hey, Remy, you know what I mean? Like just a real high-pitched voice, and he pees all over the floor, and here we go. We're having a really good time. Have you ever thought about what marks a dog's life? There's about 4 things that mark a dog's life. We can talk about eating, going to the bathroom, playing, and sleeping. Those are the 4 things that define and mark a puppy, a dog's life. And I don't know about you, maybe I'm just jealous of that life. That sounds like a really good life to me. But the question we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what marks every part of your life? What marks every part of your life? How would you describe you? Isn't it true that people often describe us by what we do? And here's what I know. This room this morning is filled with ridiculously talented people. God has been so kind to us, and he's wired each and every one of us with a very unique set of gifts. And so some of you, are crazy talented. Some of you come from incredible, great families. Others have great skill sets, and you're equipped in an amazing trade, or you have really high education, or you have a lot of hobbies you've accomplished, or sports, things that you've done in your life. You can be known by all sorts of things. Maybe another question to wrestle with is, how do people actually experience you? Do you realize how people experience you will be determined by what you leave people with? And so you can leave people with them experiencing a generous heart, or experiencing a compassionate heart, or experiencing a kind heart, or you can leave people in such a way in a conversation where they feel drained by you, or discouraged by you, or actually you rob joy from them. Isn't it interesting how people in our interactions with them will use our interactions to define our character? Listen, in what marks every part of your life? Are you leaving the mark that you actually want to leave? I don't know about you, but I don't want to be defined by my skill sets. I don't want my life to be defined by my failures. I certainly don't want my life to be defined by my hobbies or other things that I'm good at. I don't want my life to be defined by my brokenness. I want my life to be defined by the greatness of Jesus. Him and him alone. That's what I want my life to be defined as. And so what marks every part of your life? We're going to be in 1 John chapter 3, starting in verse 11 this morning, and we're going to talk about love. And so here's the first thing we're going to see, is that we're called to be marked for the existence of love. Look at verse 11. It says, "For this is the message that you've heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him." In verse 11, it starts out by saying, this is the message that we've heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Now here's the thing. This verse, in verse 11, is actually building off what was established in verse 10. If you look back at verse 10, we actually see, it mentions children of God, and it mentions children of the devil. And so here's the point. The evidence of how you live your life is clear to what camp you actually belong in. Do you love, or do you hate? Do you love, or do you hate? You see, if you profess to know Christ, it's because at some point in your life, the love of Jesus has had a significant impact on you. In fact, Jesus said this in John 15:12, Jesus said, "This is my command, that you love one another as I have loved you." Notice this, the reigning king demands that you and I are to be known by our love. Jesus is saying this, listen, the love that you have for others is based on the love that I have for you. Check out this text from John 13:34. He says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another." Notice the word must. Jesus isn't asking, Jesus is telling. He's demanding. The expectation is that you must love. Here's another example in John 15:17. "These things I command you so that you will love one another." Here's the thing. Isn't it true that love is at the heartbeat of the gospel? And you and I are called to love consistently, and we are called to love continually. It marks every part of the life of a believer. In fact, I would go so far to say this, that nothing should mark your life more than love. Nothing. Not a single thing should mark you more than love. And we're called to love every time, not sometimes, according to the text. And so is your life marked by the love that saved you? Is your life marked by the love that saved you? You see, if you're not described by love, the question you have to wrestle with is, do you even know Jesus? Because it's hypocritical to say that I love God with my mouth, but with my actions, I'm not loving others. Look at verse 12. Verse 12, he gave the example of Cain and Abel, right? He said, "We should not be like Cain, who was one of the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. And so here's what John does. John talks about, hey, you're called to love one another, and then he's going to give you an example of what he means. And he's talking about Cain and Abel all the way back to Genesis chapter 4. Now here's what's unique. This is the only direct quote of the Old Testament in the whole book of 1 John. This is it right here. How many of you remember the story of Cain and Abel? Maybe if you grew up in church, you remember the story, right? Cain is known for murdering his brother. So think about this for a moment. Think about how fast sin progressed when it entered the world. Like Adam and Eve are created, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, they're living in the garden. Genesis 3, they choose to eat of the tree they're not supposed to eat of. And then Genesis 4, the next generation, we have murder already. Like that's wild. Like we skipped over like punching or name calling. We skipped over maybe silent treatment. We skipped over skipping the birthday party. We went right to murder. Like this is wild what's happening in this text. And what motivated Cain's heart? Listen, what motivated Cain's heart is that Abel made a better sacrifice than him. And so Cain had hate inside him, and he hated his brother for what had happened, even though his brother had nothing to do with his own sin. It wasn't an Abel problem, it was a Cain problem. Do you realize, here's what he's saying, love and hate cannot exist in the same heart. Love and hate cannot define who we are. They both cannot reign. You see, love says you before me, but hate says me before you. In verse 13, he says this, do not be surprised, brothers, that the world actually hates you. John uses the word brothers 15 times in the book of 1 John. He's talking about believers. So hey, believers, those of you who know Jesus, know this, the world's going to stand in opposition to you. In fact, Jesus said this, the world's gonna hate you because they hate me. The world's gonna hate you because they hate my name. The world's gonna hate you because you belong to me, Jesus is saying. In other words, the world actually hates love. But John is telling us this, the existence of love in our life is the evidence, is the proof of life change for us. So he's not saying this. He's not saying that you gain eternal life by loving others. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you love others, which is proof of your eternal life, that Jesus has actually changed who you are. And so the question is, where's the evidence of love in your life? When I ask that question, we think, yeah, of course I love, but typically we only think about those in our circle. Do you love those who are other than you? Who are different than you? Who come from a different walk of life than you? A different life experience than you? Or is it only those that are the same as you? That's what he's saying. We are called to love one another. We're called to love everybody. We're called to be marked by this idea of love. And here's what John is telling you. If your life is not marked by love, there's a problem. There's a problem. Does love define you? What marks every part of your life? Listen, we're called to be marked by the existence of love, but secondly, I want us to see we're called to be marked by the example of love. Look at verse 16 with me. He says this, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, that we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and truth. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. He says, by this we know love. Here's what John is about to do. John is going to give you the ultimate example of what love actually is. And without this example, we'd have no concept of what it means to put others' needs ahead of our own. He's giving you the ultimate truth of what love actually is. And so what is love? He says, by this we know love. That Jesus in verse 16 laid down his life for us. You see, it's in this verse that love starts to take shape. It's in this verse that we start to realize what love actually is. And while we say this on the most simplistic definition, that love is you before me, we know this, that the word love has a theological depth to it that is significant. And so love, you before me, but there's other aspects to love that are important. And this verse helps us see that. By this we know love, that Jesus laid down his life for us. So what else can we say about love? We can also say this, that love has a cost. That love has a cost. And what did it cost Jesus? Listen, it cost him to leave his throne. It cost him to set his crown aside. It cost him to come and be wrapped in flesh, to live the perfect life, to be beaten for our sin, to be nailed to the cross, to be placed in a tomb. All of that is under the umbrella of love. You see, love then is self-sacrifice. Love is self-substitution. And what was the cost? The cost was Jesus' life. But here's the thing, not only is love you before me, and not only does love speak to the cost of something, but love is also to assign value. To assign value. You see, every time you want to love, every time you choose to love, here's what you're wrestling with. The question is this: what is this thing or this person worth? What is this thing or this person worth? By the way, this is why Jesus is the greatest example of what love actually is, because it's in his sacrifice that you and I find our greatest worth. He declared this over you: you are worth it to me. The cost is worth it for you to know me. Like, he went all in for you and I. He did all the work. You see, here's what we learn. You are worth what somebody is willing to pay. And the truth is this: Jesus was willing to lay it all aside for you and for me. Think about that. Every right Jesus had, he laid aside. All the authority Jesus had, he laid aside. The power Jesus had, he laid aside. You see, so if you want to know what you're worth, friend, all you have to do is look at the cross. We find our worth there. We find our value there. We find the cost that Jesus put forth for us to actually know him. All it's found there. And so the ultimate example of love is found in Jesus. But that then means this, that every kind of love that we have can be patterned after Jesus. And we see examples of the love of Jesus, of putting others' needs ahead of your own in our world. We see huge samples of that, actually. Can I share a couple examples? One would be this. Love being you before me, I would say every man and woman who has served in our armed forces is a prime example that fought for our freedom as a country of what love actually is, right? Is there any men or women who served in our armed forces here? Would you stand? Anyone here that served in any capacity? All right, we have multiple, all right? Can we just thank them for their service, right? right? It's an example of love. Millions of men and women in our history have served for the freedom to purchase the freedom of our country. And we know hundreds of thousands have actually laid down their life like they paid the ultimate cost. Why? Because it was worth it to them. It was worth it to them. Here's another example of love of you before me. We can see what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and we can talk about the president of Ukraine. You see, he was offered by many European countries and by our own government to get out of town, to get out of Ukraine. You can lead your country from another place. And what did he say? He said, I will absolutely not leave my home. I'm not leaving my people. I'm not leaving, right? So here's the thing. He had the right. He had the authority. He had the power and the connection to get out. And he chose, in light of all of that, to actually lay it aside and to actually stay. In fact, I think it was last weekend, he told all the European leaders through a teleconference that this might be the last time I see you. You see, he's willing to lay down his life for his countrymen. We could talk about another example in Ukraine. It's the Church of Jesus there. Love is you before me, right? And there's many pastors and churches that have chosen to stay back, not get out. I think the update I saw was 1.5 million people have already left Ukraine. And many of the believers are choosing to stay. Why? Because they realize that for their countrymen, this might be the only window for them to really hear about the love of Jesus. They're saying, man, I'm going to put my right aside to get out, and I'm going to stay here so they can hear about the good news of Jesus. Now look back at verse 16 with me. Those are examples of love. It says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our life for our brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Listen, the second part of verse 16 is the hard part for us. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. Here's the second part. We also ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. And here's the truth. We can talk about the example of love all day. You could all share examples of what we're talking about and how you've seen it played out in your sphere of influence with connections you have, or maybe even in your own life. But here's what we're seeing, that loving others often is laying aside our rights for the sake of others. And so here's the question. Are your rights and your preferences more important than your love? Are your rights and your preferences more important than your love? Can we just take a few moments this morning and generally assess the evangelical world the last 2 years? I've had ample time to talk to all sorts of pastors in our city. And we've seen a lot of different things happening around our own city, let alone our own country. And so I want to speak to a few things from a 30,000-foot view. And I want you to know something, that all these things have crazy different depths to them and different angles to them. And so I'm just doing a flyby, so I don't need anyone to be angry at me or send me an email, okay? But I want to speak to some of the things that we've seen based on what the text is telling us today. 2 weeks ago, we were in the book of 1 John, and we saw that John told us this in chapter 2, that the Antichrist is coming, yet many Antichrists have come. And so we spent some time talking about what that actually means. What does it mean that there are many Antichrists present? You see, we talked about that Satan's plan is not like Russia's plan, where they're just bringing tanks and all sorts of armored vehicles to cross the border in Ukraine. You can see him coming for miles. That's not how Satan works. He's coming in subtly into the church, and he has a plan, and here's his plan. His plan is to convince me and to convince you to take a good thing, make it a God thing. That's a bad thing. That's the plan. That's how he's worked from the very beginning. For you to take a good thing like your liberty, your rights, your politics, your social views, make them a God thing, and then it ends up going poorly, because here's what actually happens. We stunt gospel growth in our hearts and our lives when we take good things and we make them God things. And so when I've spoken to all sorts of pastors around our city, here's what you've seen it too, all right? We've seen the evangelical community take really good things and wave those flags higher than the flag of the gospel. Am I right? We've seen people wave Christian nationalism above the gospel. It's happening all over our city. It's a distraction. We're taking a good thing, we're making it a God thing, and it ends up going bad for us. So let me speak to a few ways we've seen that. One I mentioned 2 weeks ago. Satan's subtle plan is to enter the church, to get his own with their own mission, right? To get your mind and your focus off what matters most and putting on things that are good things but make them ultimate things. And I mentioned 2 weeks ago that Satan has somehow convinced us to get our focus off him, off the real enemy, the power and principalities of this world, and turn our focus to one another, the brothers that this text is talking about, and we go at one another based on social and political issues. Listen, we're flesh and blood, right? Like, that's who we are. We're not actually enemies. Do you know that? The enemy is Satan, and he's convinced us to make enemies out of one another. By the way, this kind of plan that Satan had happened in Jesus' day when he came on the scene. They thought he was going to overthrow the government too. No, he had a much bigger mission in mind than that. Maybe we need to learn from history. Here's a second thing I would say if I want to zoom in a little bit more. Because of our attention to fight one another and not love one another, we've now seen a shift to where there's this crazy divisiveness that's happened amongst God's people. And now we get 2 years of data to look back on, right? And I'm hoping we're turning out of the pandemic. Like, I'm hoping that masks are gone for good. I'm hoping all that stuff is kind of done, right? It's been a weird 2 years. But we've seen so much tension around a mask and around a vaccine. Here we go, okay? Isn't it a good thing that we live in a country that we get to decide what's best for us? That's what people fought for, right? Like that's our liberty that we have. And so we should have the authority to decide what is best to put on our face or what is best to put in our body. And I agree with that. And there's tension all over around these things. And are there not two sides? Can we just speak to them? There's pro-mask and pro-vaccine, and there's anti-mask and anti-vaccine. Those have been the two tensions, right, over the last 2 years and how people want to handle that. Here's the question. Why is someone pro-mask and pro-vaccine? Listen, there's probably many reasons, but one of them is safety. They think that's what's safe, right? Do we agree with that? Can I go to talk to the other side? Why is someone anti-mask, anti-vaccine? One of the many reasons is safety, right? We're not going to wear them out. I don't think it's safe. I'm not going to get a vaccine. I don't know if it's safe, right? That's the tension. So can we just agree that actually on both sides of the equation, on both sides, they actually all want the same thing. They just have a different plan of how you actually accomplish it and how you actually get the outcome that would actually be desired. And to be honest, we have both sides in the room this morning. Welcome to Redemption Church. We're so glad that you are here. Can I push for a minute? Here's the problem. The gospel never promises your safety. I don't find it anywhere in the Bible that the gospel promises me that I'm going to be safe. Look at the 12 disciples for a moment. All of them died for their faith. Every single one of them, except John, by the way, who's the author of this book that we're looking at, who actually was boiled in oil for his faith in Jesus. So he suffered significantly. And we should make decisions based on safety. I'm not saying that. I make them every day. You do too. That's a good thing. I'm just trying to tell you that your safety is not a God thing, and you need to understand that. It's important for us to realize that. Jesus never guarantees your safety when you follow him. And so guess what happens? When we elevate safety, a good thing to become a God thing, it results in a bad thing. And here's what the result is. I'll never be willing to lay down my life for anybody else if it takes away my safety. It'll never happen. And so we have our rights, we have our politics, we have our liberties, and if those things that are really good things that I have views and I love them and I value them, but if those things become the God thing, I will forsake love every single time. So listen, Redemption Church, in the celebration of our liberty, we get to stand for what we believe is right, but the Bible never gives you permission to stand in your liberty at the absence of love. Never. Yet I feel like love's gone out the window. And so if we choose liberty and rights and politics over obedience to the Bible, do you realize that's a problem? God has a kingdom he's expanding. God has a mission he's on. He's invited you into it, and we're distracting the world from what matters most when we elevate other things over the mission and the scriptures and the Bible and our love. And so I'm telling you, have a view, have an opinion, take a stand. You have a right to do that as an American, but can we just channel that in its proper place? I think another way to say it is this: the what people believe about an issue. The what people believe about an issue most of the time is debatable. Not all issues are debatable to me, and I'm sure you have convictions about stuff too, right? But the what people believe most of the time is debatable, but what's not debatable in the Bible is the how. It's not up for debate. We are called to actually love one another through all things and in all ways. That's the expectation. And so if you are wrong in how you are right, please know you're wrong. You're wrong. If you're wrong in how you're right, you are actually wrong. And so the challenge for you and I is that our liberties can become a good thing, can become a God thing, and guess what will happen? We'll be unwilling to lay down our lives for others. But again, I've already told you, the gospel does not promise your safety. And by the way, just to be honest, it doesn't guarantee our American liberty either. I sure hope I'm free to worship Jesus my whole life here in America. I really hope that. But is it possible? I hope not. Is it possible that in God's sovereignty, he could allow something to happen in our country to where we might actually lose this right here? But why would he do that in his sovereignty? Maybe he's gonna say this: my mission's gonna expand in a totally different way. It's gonna go faster. It's gonna burn through hearts quicker in a different way. And so we get to trust the Lord in that, right? I don't know what's gonna happen. I'm just trying to tell you that it could be different than what we expect. But can I give you good news? When good things, like your liberty, your politics, your social issues, your rights, when those things stay good things, the gospel flourishes in our hearts and in our city. Do you understand the goodness of that? And so let's keep good things, because they are good. We need to love them and value them, but we need them in the right place and the right angle in our hearts and in our lives. And so I love what this text is telling us to do, because we're called to love not just in what we say, but in how we actually live. And here's what I know by verse 17. When you go back, if you go read it yourself, I know this: it's probably true that I'll never be called to lay down my life for somebody else. It's possible that God might call me to lay down my life for somebody else. And if I don't love, I'll be unwilling to do it. But can we just move away from that idea for a moment and just talk about what would it look like for you to lay down your life with your time, your talents, and your treasures? Because sometimes to love others isn't about life and death. Sometimes it's simply about putting others' needs ahead of my own. And that's the call. That's the example for us. We're called to be marked by the example of love. Church, do we get this? Church, do we get this? What marks every part of your life? Here's the third thing. We're called to be marked with the expectation to love. Look at verse 20 with me. It says, for whenever our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows everything. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence before God, and whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments to do what pleases him. And this is the commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he has commanded us. Whoever keeps his commandments abides in God, and God in him. And by this we know that he abides in us, by the Spirit whom he has given us. Listen, we are called to love in word and deed. We're also called to love in action. But isn't it true? What's natural for me is to love me. I don't know if that's natural for you, but it's natural for me to love me. It's natural for me not to put you first. What's natural for me is to put myself first, to be concerned about what I want, because I'm most important in my life. Anyone else agree with that? Not that I'm most important in your life, but that you know what I mean. And so loving others, I think, is actually hard. And I think that's one thing we've missed over the last 2 years. But guess what happens when I fail to love others? Because I know Christ, sometimes my flesh brings out condemnation on me. Ever been there before? Where it's like, I failed again. In whatever area in your life, you've not been getting it right. I've been putting others' needs ahead of my own. And so my flesh actually brings about condemnation on me, but the text is so beautiful this morning that anyone who's a failure at loving others, there's actually good news for you, just like there's good news for me, because the text tells us this, that God is greater than our hearts and he knows everything. So here's the beauty. When you love great, God sees you. When you fail to love others, God sees you. He sees you. And he invades the condemnation that your heart and your sin and your flesh pull out on you, and he wants to inspire you and encourage you out of that with the good news that you have a God who's actually for you. Do you ever do what you do not want to do? I do. And it makes me angry. That sometimes I would do the things that I know I don't want to do. It bothers me, it frustrates me, and it brings about condemnation, but the gospel enters that because God is actually greater, and he brings about hope in our hearts and in our lives. And so I think the beauty of the gospel is this, is that in your failure to love Jesus and others, he wants you to know that he loves you, and he accepts you if you know him. We're just free to love, friends. We're free to love. You see, there's a difference between our conscience and his omniscience, which is amazing. We get to verse 21, we have the first word in there, we have the word beloved, which we've seen multiple times in this series. The idea to be fully known, yet fully loved. You see, when I think about God's love, I think about what Ephesians 5 tells us, that we are Christ's bride. Have you thought about that recently? I remember when my wife walked down the aisle almost 17 years ago this summer. Everyone stood, watched her come down this long aisle. I'm at the end of the aisle. I'm thinking, man, this woman is way out of my league, is what I'm thinking. And if you know her, you know what I mean, right? Some of you are shaking your head, yes. Okay. But I saw her coming down the aisle, and her radiant beauty and her gentleness and her kindness and incredible compassion that she carries around with her. And I thought, God, this woman you're giving to me to treasure. Yet when I think about being Christ's bride, I ask the question, why would he want me? When we come down the spiritual aisle, walking to Jesus, and we're just a disaster. We don't love others, we only love ourselves. Why would someone want to marry that person? We don't ever put anyone's needs ahead of our own. Why would someone want a relationship with that kind of person? Yet Jesus says, I want you. He sees you and all of your sinful choices and your sinful intention and every sinful desire. He declares, yes, this is the bride that I want. This one's mine. And so it's true then, which is important for us, that he declares when you come down the aisle that he loves you. But Jesus, do you see me? Are you really seeing me? God is greater than our hearts, and he sees everything. There's nothing that you can hide from him. You've been fully exposed to him, and he meets you in that moment, and he says, I love you. That experience, understanding that, changes the game for you as to why you even exist in this world. And so here's the point. We've been talking about having a gospel culture in our church, and here's what's true. Love is going to be the defining thing. It's going to be the defining thing. And so our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is the gospel culture is marked by the presence of love. And I don't know if you saw it, but in verse 23 and 24, we saw again the three things that we've been using to define a gospel culture in a church. In fact, if you look back at it, we see in verse 23 that a gospel culture is about a gospel belief. It says, believe in the name of his son, Jesus Christ. And then we see in the same verse, we see again that we're called to get after a gospel culture, right? By having a gospel behavior, which is to love one another, it says in verse 23. And then we get to verse 24 and we see this gospel belonging where he says, right, I abide in you and you abide in me. So what's a gospel culture? The gospel culture is defined by a belief and a behavior and a belonging, and those things all overlap with one another. But we can make the observation then that a gospel culture is impossible without love. Impossible. Love must be present. It's of utmost importance to us. And I want you to know from our leadership to you, I want you to know this, that our heartbeat is to love you when you walk in this door. And I know this, that we don't always walk in here wanting to be here. We don't always walk in having a great week, right? Sometimes it's been a great week. Sometimes we've messed our life up. Sometimes we've lived to glorify ourselves and we're carrying all sorts of weight and we're carrying all sorts of garbage. And we just want you to know, in light of all that you come in with, there's a God who's actually for you and he loves you. And we just say all the time that it's okay not to be okay. It's just not okay to stay there. And so we want to love you well, and we don't always get it right, but the heartbeat is for us to meet you with the good news of Jesus, because love should be the defining thing of who we are as a church. But I want to give us an applicational step as a church. It's been fun for us to move back into this space. And last week, being our first week here, we realized that we're already over 70% full as a church in here. And so here's what we need to do. We need your help to help love our city. We need your help to help serve and volunteer across the board in our church. And so I want to invite you to join into the mission that we're on of connecting people to Jesus for life change. The mission we're on is actually vital. I'm giving my life to it, and I believe it's worthy of us all giving our life to it, because we're fighting for God's kingdom, and we're fighting for people to find what can only be found in Jesus. And so we want you to help us to actually love people that are not even here yet, that are yet to walk through the doors over the next weeks and months here at Redemption Church. And so we want to invite you in. And so the next 2 weeks, and next week and the following week, we're going to have just a little volunteer fair. You're going to leave and walk right out the doors in the lobby. We'll have every team lead out there, and we need to fill a crazy amount of slots, right? And we need your help to do that, because I know this, at some point, we're anticipating we'll have to go back to 2 services. We get to go back, I should say, to 2 services. And so we're excited about how God's moving and working, but we need more help across the board in every area of ministry. And so I want to invite you to be a part of that mission with us, to help us love people. And we want to love you, and we want to love the person next to you, and we want to love the empty chair next to you as well, because someone else is going to sit there someday and hear about the good news of Jesus. And so everything that we do here is vital. Every area of ministry, from parking lot, greeter, hospitality, usher, kids ministry, setup crew, tech team, everything is vital to what we're doing. And so we need your help. And so the next 2 weeks, would you please consider signing up to dominate an area of ministry for us? I want us to look back at verse 16 again, and I want us to turn our minds to communion. And it says this: by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. He laid down his life for us. Listen, today we want to partake as a church family in communion. And communion is an opportunity to remember the beauty and the reality of the gospel. And when you look at that verse, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. I want you to think about that verse, and I want you to make it personal for a moment. That Jesus laid down his life for you. He laid down his life for you personally. And so we use 2 elements, and if you didn't get an element, there's some that are in the back there behind each section, but we have the bread, which stands for the life that Jesus gave. That Jesus actually gave his life for you. We also have the juice, which is a picture of his blood that was actually shed for you and I on the cross. That it wasn't you who died, it was him who died for us. And so communion is a way for us to wrestle with the good news of the gospel again. And so we encourage you, you can gather with your family around the room if you want. You can gather alone, just stay by yourself in your chair with your family in your row. You're free to do whatever you want to do, but we have the 2 elements. And so we want to give you a moment just to spend time with the Lord. What do you need to confess? What needs to be made right with him? Because communion is really for believers only. It's for those who know Christ. And so if you don't know Christ, I would just ask you to consider verse 16, that Jesus laid down his life for you. And what could that mean in your life? And so let's just take a moment in our seats. Feel free to gather with your family, however you want to do that. And let's just spend some time praying and thanking the Lord for his sacrifice on our behalf.